With Cyno being released as the newest on-field DPS, many comparisons have been drawn between him and Xiao. They are both edgy polearm users, and you know what? I think I'm starting to see a pattern with the characters I main. Since I'm a Xiao main, I thought it would make perfect sense to compare the two characters because I love both of their playstyles. But before I do that, I just want to remind everyone to sub and like to help out the channel to see if we can reach 1.5k subs soon and help out with the algorithm. Thanks, and I appreciate it a bunch. So I'm going to compare them as much as I can possibly remember, so feel free to remind me about something if I forget about it. Let's start with Cyno. From my own experience, I know this is a very early take about him. He is a EM scaling main DPS character that focuses on single target. The reason why I personally believe he focuses mainly on a single target DPS is that most of the time I really feel like his animations have a rough time hitting multiple targets. However, that's not to say that he sucks at AoE, because that's not true. His skill inside of his burst really helps with that. He just needs a bit of help grouping up the enemies so that his attacks will connect with multiple. The main thing that he has over Xiao gameplay-wise is that his energy problems aren't really as noticeable, because unlike Xiao, he is able to generate energy during his burst, which helps out a ton, and depending on the team, energy isn't even a problem at all, especially with another Electro unit. I haven't tested with Kuki or Miko with Cyno, but I can say that Beidou and Fischl are both really good with him for both Electro Resonance, extra particle generation, and of course damage. He is also very free-to-play friendly. His weapons are easily obtainable. You have White Tassel, Keychain Cross Spear, the new Sumeru polearm I believe is pretty good, and the new Event Spear also seems pretty good too. I wouldn't say that they are better than R5 White Tassel, but since you can't get R5 Tassel after farming the entirety of Liyue, those options are still on the table. His team comps are also very free-to-play accessible. His best supports right now are Dendro Traveler and Fischl, both of which are pretty good right now. Xingqiu is pretty good if you want to run him in a Taser or Hyper Bloom, as well as for defensive utility. Beidou is also pretty good for him with damage. It's very rare that we get to see an on-field Electro main DPS work well with her. Sucrose works pretty well since Cyno loves using EM, and for the grouping as well. The list goes on. There are still a lot of 5-star characters that I haven't listed that are amazing with him. And speaking of 5 stars, if you get a constellation for him, they are actually pretty decent and useful to some degree compared to another character that we know. The option he has for artifacts are also quite flexible, with many 4-piece and 2-piece options working well for him. Let's talk about the negatives now. I very often find myself struggling to build a team around him. He scales very well with EM, so it only feels natural to put him in an Aggravate or Hyper Bloom team, so a Dendro character feels natural to use. And plus, why the hell would I use Electrocharge if EM scaling for it is so weak? And Overload? Yeah, good luck with that, especially with a melee character. I'm not saying that he can't work outside of Dendro, but for me, he seems significantly weaker outside of those teams. To make rotations feel smoother, I would like to use another Electro character. Either Beidou or Fischl seems like a very good option. But when it comes to the last team member, this is when it becomes very difficult. Do you want an Animo unit? Well, you have Crowd Control and Viridescent Shred, but you have no defensive options other than Beidou or maybe even Kuki? Do you bring Zhongli or Xingqiu? You have protection and a bit of res shred, but you lose out on crowd control. Do you bring a healer? Now you're essentially losing out on previously mentioned options. Do you swap the Electro Battery out for another character? Now you lose a good amount of energy and less efficient rotations. Without a healer or a shielder, Cyno will be very vulnerable to interruptions and will get messed up during his rotation. But I honestly feel like the lack of flexibility is due to how there aren't many options for Dendro right now, and he really feels attached to both Aggravate and Hyper Bloom. He feels very attached to those reactions because of how well he scales with EM, in my personal opinion. The Dendro applicator and healer would be so convenient for Cyno right now. Let's talk about the negatives of his playstyle. As much as I do like using characters with a long burst duration, it can be a big inconvenience at times. I often find Cyno being very vulnerable to attacks just as I mentioned. The way that he staggers enemies is both a good and bad thing for him. I feel like it's a decent amount to protect him, but it still pushes them away and it will ruin your rotations. And in boss fights, the staggering effect doesn't even matter, and you will likely need an extra defensive utility, unless you're good at the game. Unlike me. A lot of the buffs don't last long enough to justify Cyno being on field for so long. More often than not, I find myself swapping a bit early to make rotations feel smoother. Let's talk about Xiao, my main. His playstyle is kind of the opposite compared to Cyno. He excels at AoE damage but isn't as good at single target DPS, but still does more damage than what people think. Xiao doesn't rely on reactions to do his damage. He doesn't have as many energy problems as most people think, but I still think it's more noticeable than Cyno. He's not very free-to-play friendly in both terms of weapons and team comps, but his teams are more flexible. The reason why I say that is because his best teams really require more 4 stars than the average team, but he can still perform well without them. Like, a lot of the 4-star options available are really good with him. With that out the way, who do I think is better? I promise I'm saying this without any bias whatsoever, but I think Xiao is still the better character. The reason why I say this is for a few reasons. Although Xiao is still vulnerable inside of his burst, it's a lot harder for enemies to hit Xiao with how fast he is compared to Cyno, who is mostly stuck in place while attacking. Xiao is also able to stagger enemies more often, which is a very sharp double-edged sword. It keeps him safe majority of the time, but he won't be able to damage a lot of the enemies around him because they get pushed away very easily. However, there are many workarounds like bringing another Anemo character and pushing them against the wall so they don't move away as much. You can say the same thing for Cyno, but I feel like bringing an Anemo character for Xiao is much more encouraged for energy. And personally, I highly value Xiao's flexibility and team comps as an on-field DPS compared to Cyno, since we don't really have many options for him, especially since an Electro Battery for Resonance and Particles help him by a long shot. I do think Xiao's rotation is a bit smoother because of the downtime of his burst allows him to funnel energy quickly so he can catch his burst on cooldown. And because Cyno relies on reactions much more, his setup naturally feels longer because there are many more characters that need their burst to fully optimize Cyno's damage. I will say though, Cyno has a much higher damage ceiling compared to Xiao, even with free-to-play options, since Anemo isn't typically a DPS element and there is no dedicated Anemo resistance shredding character, and oh man, Quicken is just such a good reaction for damage. But as they say, damage isn't everything. You gotta look at everything outside of that as well, right? Even though I personally think that Xiao is the overall better character, in my opinion, that doesn't take away that Cyno is a good character himself. They both aren't meta-defining, but they are both hella fun to play, and I think that's all that matters in Genshin. Just having fun, right? Thanks for watching, everyone. Remember to sub and like if you enjoyed, help out the channel so we can reach 1.5k subs soon, and maybe even 2k. Feel free to join the Discord for notifications about all my uploads, access to older stream VODs, and a place to chill and hang out. Have a good night and day wherever you're at, and I'll see you all next time. Peace, and take care.